Angeles Times Festival of Books, where all day we'll be bringing you live coverage of author events and panels. Beginning shortly, an author panel on religion and the politics of faith. It'll be moderated by Jonathan Kirsch. Starting shortly, an author panel on religion and the politics of faith. It'll be moderated by Jonathan Kirsch, author of A History of the End of the World. It'll feature author Reza Aslan, Chris Hedges, and Jack Miles. Now, live coverage of the LA Times Festival of Books.
Allowing a few people to enter here. We're asking that they be as quiet as you all are. And thank you so much in advance. Bye-bye.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Although you've already been sharply admonished, I've been told that it's critically important that I admonish you further. Signings. There is a book signing following this session. Book signing for this panel is located at the North Signing Area, Line D. This area is noted on the festival map in the center of the event program. Personal taping of sessions is not allowed. Food or drinks are not allowed in the session rooms. And as you've heard already, please turn off all cell phones and pagers for the duration of this session. I am going to introduce our panelists. I will then pose some questions to them and engage them in conversation, and towards the end of our session, we'll open the mics and invite you to ask your questions. Jack Miles, on my right, is a distinguished professor of English and Religious Studies, University of California, Irvine, newly appointed in that position, Senior Fellow for Religious Affairs with the Pacific Council on International Policy, a MacArthur Fellow, and currently Scholar in Residence at the Getty Research Institute. He's a scholar and a writer whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and many other publications. His book, God, a Biography, won a Pulitzer Prize in 1996 and has been translated into 16 languages over a period of nearly 20 years. Ending in 1995, Miles was successively an editor at Doubleday, executive editor at the University of California Press, literary editor at the Los Angeles Times, and finally a member of the Times editorial board writing on politics and culture. He's the general editor of the forthcoming Norton Anthology of World Religions. He's also the author of Christ, A Crisis in the Life of God, and I'm happy and always grateful to be able to acknowledge him as a friend and a mentor, one of many writers for whom he has served graciously and generously in that role. Chris Hedges is a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School and has served as a correspondent for 2 decades, most of them for the New York Times, reporting from Central America at the height of the fighting in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua in the early 80s, as well as the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. Hedges was part of the New York Times team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for reporting on global terrorism. He also won the 2002 Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. He has taught at Columbia, Princeton, and NYU, and he is currently a Lannan Literary Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the Nation Institute. Hedges writes for numerous publications, including Foreign Affairs, Harper's, Mother Jones, and the New York Review of Books. He is the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, What Every Person Should Know About War, and Losing Moses on the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America. His current book is American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. Reza Aslan is a regular commentator for NPR's Marketplace and Middle East analyst for CBS News. He has written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Slate, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Chicago Tribune, the Nation, and others, and has appeared on Meet the Press, Hardball, The Daily Show, Real Time with Bill Meyer, The Colbert Report, Anderson Cooper, and Nightline. His first book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, has been translated into half a dozen languages and was shortlisted for the Guardian UK First Book Award and nominated for a PEN USA Award for Research Nonfiction. Born in Iran, he now lives in Santa Monica, where he is a research associate at the University of Southern California's Center on Public Diplomacy. His next book, How to Win a Cosmic War, Why We're Losing the War on Terror, will be published by Random House in the fall of 2008. And just so as not to lose out on the opportunity for self-promotion, I am the author, most recently, of A History of the End of the World, How the Most Controversial Book in the Bible Changed the Course of Western Civilization. Thank you. As I was preparing for this wonderful, exciting, stimulating panel, I read in the Los Angeles Times, as I suppose you did as well, about some aspects of religion and politics in our own culture, in our own environment. I read that the United States Department of Veteran Affairs has approved the Wiccan pentacle as an approved emblem of belief on the graves of soldiers who have lost their lives in Iraq. And this is along with such religions as Ekankar, Sufism Reoriented, and Seecho Ni-Ei, of religion I never heard of before. And I offered that as a kind of exhibit A of the open-mindedness towards religion in American politics. We've also read, I think, such a thoroughly American story about the Minneapolis Community and Technical College, which has announced its intention to install facilities for the Muslim ritual of foot washing after students had been forced to engage in that ritual in waist-high sinks. And in a very American gesture, they first made a field trip to a community college in Michigan to inspect the ritual foot baths that had been installed in that facility. These are, of course, gestures of tolerance and open-mindedness that I think we have come to expect and value and appreciate in our own culture. But we also read in recent weeks about an incident that took place on April 22nd in Iraq. If there was not enough heartbreak and horror coming out of that country, there's an incident in which 23 people, members of a faith called Yazidism, were seized, arrested, and shot in the Mosul province of Iraq because of their membership in this faith. Presumably, the pretext for this atrocity was that at an earlier date, a member of the Yazidi community, having fallen in love with a Muslim and converted to Islam, was stoned to death by her own community as a punishment for apostasy. And I went into the books to find out a little bit about Yazidism, which I knew nothing about. One of the secondary benefits of this horror in Iraq is that we've learned a good deal as a nation about the difference between Shiite Islam and Sunni Islam, but there are many other religions in Iraq. And I found out that Yazidism, as small and obscure as it is in fact one small and obscure branch of another small and obscure religion that has two other branches. It's called Yazdanism. The other branches are Alevism and Yarsanism. They're primarily ethnic Kurds. It's a syncretistic religion drawing on Sufi traditions of Islam, from Islam drawing on Christian and Jewish iconography, and incorporating far older Persian religious ideas. It is that contrast that I think we will be confronting today, the contrast between an attitude towards religion that allows and appreciates diversity and an attitude towards religion that leads to violence. I'm going to begin by allowing us all to hear the words of our individual panelists and then inviting each one to comment on the themes raised in the quotation. The first reading I'm going to give very briefly is from an essay by Jack Miles, The Missionary Moment, Christian America in the World War of Ideas, where Jack writes, in his second inaugural address, President Bush spoke of freedom rather than of Christianity, and yet the perception is more widespread now than ever, both at home and abroad, that the United States is in the throes of a Christian revival fully capable of shaping the decisions of the American government as directly as it sought recently to do in the case of Terry Schiavo. I submit that, much against the grain of that revival, what effective diplomacy, effective international proselytization requires at this juncture is minimally a forthright disassociation of American polity from Christian evangelism, and beyond that, a reassertion both at home and abroad of the religious neutrality of the American Constitution. What was done at the time of the Treaty of Tripoli must be done again. And Jack, I'll invite you to illuminate us on the Treaty of Tripoli and to apply that to the steps that you're calling on us to take today.
It is interesting to recall that the first foreign war that the United States ever engaged in was a war with a Muslim power. It was the war that was undertaken against the Barbary pirates. That's what we hear in the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Tripoli was a city-state that preyed on shipping and enhanced its income by holding captives for ransom. The United States chose to stop paying the ransom and try to halt this practice by military action. The outcome was actually rather indecisive. The skirmishing went on for quite a while, but it was ended with a treaty. And in this treaty, one clause states that religion shall never be a cause of enmity between Tripoli and the United States, because the United States is, and I quote, in no way founded upon the Christian religion. Now, this treaty was very thoroughly debated, clause by clause, in Congress. Some of our foreign treaties are simply ratified on a kind of up and down vote. They aren't closely examined by Congress. But this one was very closely examined and then unanimously passed. To say, therefore, that the United States is not founded upon the Christian religion is not against the American grain. It is thoroughly in the American grain. The Constitution, in its First Amendment to the Constitution, states that Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And even before the First Amendment, Article 4 states that there will in this country be no religious test for public office. So an atheist can hold office, a member of any given religion may hold office. The question will never be asked, what is your religion, before you can duly stand for election to an office or be appointed to one by someone who has been elected. Because the perception abroad is now so widespread that America has left its commitment to this religious neutrality behind, I do believe that a part of our national recovery from this very difficult moment ought to be a reassertion of who we have always been and a statement that we are that again, in case any questions have arisen in anyone's mind on that point. Obviously, questions have indeed arisen on that point. We could never persuade American society to be less Christian than it is, and it's not the responsibility of our government to do anything of the sort. But a distinction has always existed here between the state and the society. America does not have an established religion. It does have an established way of dealing with religion, and that established way of dealing with religion is religious neutrality.
Thank you, John. I'm going to read very briefly from Reza Aslan's very compelling book, There Is No God But God. In the half-century since the end of colonialism and the founding of the Islamic State, Islam has been invoked to legitimize and to overturn governments, to promote republicanism and defend authoritarianism, to justify monarchies, autocracies, oligarchies, and theocracies, and to promote terrorism, factionalism, and hostility. The question remains, can Islam now be used to establish a genuinely liberal democracy in the Middle East? Can a modern Islamic state reconcile reason and revelation to create a democratic society based on the ethical ideals established by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina nearly 15 centuries ago? Not only can it do so, it must. Indeed, it already is doing so throughout parts of the Muslim world. And Reza, what I would invite you to do is to address that general comment to the situation that we see today in Iraq and the timetable that has been proposed. Is there any hope that a liberal democracy in Iraq can be achieved within the patience of the American electorate?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I feel like I'm at the kids' table here. Is it just me? Maybe it's the chair, Chris. Is that?
The microphones are about at nose level, so if you talk through your nose, you'll be heard.
I already feel somewhat inadequate sitting at this table, so I think they did the chair on purpose. Well, I think, look, it's important to make a distinction here when we're talking about these terms that are tossed around so often and often undefined, like Islamic democracy. When someone refers to this idea of Islamic democracy, we're not talking about a theo-democracy. We're talking about a modern constitutional state dedicated to all of the principles, the elements that make a democracy. And that's important. I mean, there's no such thing as democracy. There are elements that, when put together, create a democratic system, like popular sovereignty and the separation of powers and constitutionalism, the rule of law, ethnic and religious pluralism, dedication to human rights. You put all of those things, it's like a recipe, and those are all the ingredients, and you toss them into a cauldron, and what you have is a delicious soup of democracy. So then the question is, you can't take any of these elements out, otherwise the recipe collapses. But can you then put some kind of religiously inspired moral foundation into that mix? Well, not only can you, but we do all the time. I think Jack is absolutely correct that this country wasn't founded on as a Christian nation, as it is often referred to. But nevertheless, the ideologies, the customs, the mores, the national traditions of this country are deeply, deeply Christian, and not just Christian, but Protestant. And that's neither necessarily a bad thing, nor is it... I mean, in some ways, it's kind of inevitable, particularly in a democratic society. If you live in a country that says that, you know, the ideas, the values, the mores of the majority are going to, you know, have a certain amount of influence, influence that is in some ways equivalent to the numbers or the proportion of those people, then you really have no choice if you want to live in a democratic society, but to have that kind of influence in the state. We live in a country where, according to Newsweek, 78% of Americans call themselves Christian. So it's only natural that in the discussions about our laws, our customs, our values, our very identities as Americans, Christianity is going to play a very large part. In a country like Iraq, which is 96% Muslim, when it comes time to create some sense of popular sovereignty, some idea that the values of the individuals in society are going to be reflected in the values and customs and even laws of the state, as long as those laws don't violate those elements that have to be in that cauldron in order for it to be called a democratic society, then it's not necessary. I mean, there's certainly room for problems, and there's certainly room for fanaticism, as we see even in this country. But in some ways, to me, it seems like a futile enterprise to say that we need to remove religion from the public realm, and that we need to strip the state from its any kind of religious ideas or influence. That's a great idea. I wish it were possible, but it's not. Certainly not in a democratic society. If you want to live in a society in which, under the guise of democracy, religion is forcefully removed from the public realm, move to Turkey. But if you want to live in a society based not necessarily upon secularism, but upon pluralism, then you sort of have to be willing to deal with the consequences of that. And the consequences of that are that, as long as, again, it doesn't violate the laws, it doesn't violate the mandates that are necessary in it to be called a democracy, you're going to have people like, you know, Tom DeLay and Tom Tancredo and James Inhofe who are going to be motivated by their religious faith. Is it a problem? Yes. Is it avoidable? I don't think so.
Thank you, Reza. I'm going to next read from Chris Hedges' book, American Fascism, and I wanted to play a little bit of a thought experiment with you by leaving out the subject of the sentence that I'm going to read, or the section, although I think that this audience is familiar enough with Chris's book that they'll know already. But I would invite you to keep in mind militant Islam as you hear these words from American Fascism. Chris is writing about what he calls a frightening political mass movement with many similarities to other mass movements from fascism to communism to ethnic nationalist parties in the former Yugoslavia. This movement shares with these movements an inability to cope with ambiguity, doubt, and uncertainty. It creates its own truth. It embraces a world of miracles and signs and removes followers from a rational, reality-based world. It condemns self-criticism and debate as apostasy. The believers in this movement, Hedges writes, have abandoned their trust and belief in a world of science, law, and rationality. They eschew personal choice and freedom. They have replaced the world that has failed them with a new glorious world filled with prophets and mystical signs. The movement that Chris describes in his words places a premium on action and finds its final aesthetic in war and apocalyptic violence. And yet, of course, Chris is not writing about militant Islam. He's writing about what he calls radical Christian dominionists who are manipulating Christianity and millions of sincere believers and slowly dismantling democratic institutions to establish a religious tyranny, the springboard to an American fascism. Do you feel in any sense you may be overstating this case?
No, and this isn't theoretical for me. I come out of 20 years of covering disintegrating societies such as the former Yugoslavia. I've spent 7 years in the Middle East as an Arabic speaker, much of that time with groups like Hamas. This fusion of Christian language and Christian iconography with the language and iconography of American nationalism is toxic and dangerous. And it bears, it is a radical mutation or a radical break from what we have seen in American society that made up fundamentalism or fundamentalist movements. Fundamentalists always called on believers to remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, to shun political involvement. Traditional evangelicals, such as Billy Graham, always warned followers about getting too close to political power. He himself was used and burned by Richard Nixon when he came to Nixon's defense during the Watergate scandal, a lesson he never forgot. What we see now is something that we have not seen in American history with all of the religious revivals going back to 1740 and the Great Awakening. It is a drive to take secular power, and that's new. And like all totalitarian movements, it plays off of profound personal and economic despair. We live in a country where the top 1% has now amassed more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. This figure alone should frighten everyone in this room who cares about democracy. Going all the way back to the writers of Plutarch and Thucydides, those who wrote about the sustenance and nurturing of Athenian democracy, it was understood that gross disparities and inequities within a society make it impossible to sustain the democratic state. There are now less manufacturing jobs in this country than at any time, 9%, than at any time since the Industrial Revolution. And these jobs have not been replaced with jobs that offer salaries that equal, their salaries are a third less than what people were making in steel mills 20 years ago, without benefits, without health insurance, with a slashing of state and federal assistance programs. It's not overly dramatic to say that there are whole pockets of the United States that now resemble the developing world. And if you go back and read Hannah Arendt or Karl Popper or Fritz Stern's The Politics of Cultural Despair, you understand that the engine of despotic movements is this despair, because it thrusts people into the arms of demagogues. You know, the war in Yugoslavia was not caused by ancient ethnic hatreds, despite what Robert Kaplan wrote. It was caused by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. And if we don't blunt the rise of the American oligarchy and the corporate state, we're not going to blunt this movement, which is, I believe, the most dangerous mass movement in American history. It is a movement that removes people from a reality-based world. It throws them into the arms of people who promise them a world of magic, of miracles, that Jesus will not only walk with them and has a divine plan for them and take care of them, but ultimately make them prosperous and wealthy. That's where the term the gospel of prosperity comes from. And I think for those of us who grew up in a religious tradition, my father was a Presbyterian minister. As you heard, I graduated from seminary, and are biblically literate, we have a tremendous window into what the real goals of this movement are and how they have distorted, misused, and often fabricated sections of the Bible in order to embrace a theology which I think is properly called a theology of despair rather than a theology of hope. And by the term theology of despair, it is because the most glorious moment for these believers comes in that cataclysmic, apocalyptic violence, that use of violence as a massive cleansing agent, which is, of course, always part of totalitarian movements, when believers in this bizarre spiritual Darwinism will be lifted up into heaven and the rest of us will be extinguished in horrifying, I think it's not an extreme word to use, pornographic visions of violence that are peddled by this movement in the Left Behind series and others. And I think that if we as a society do not begin to confront the corporate state and the oligarchic state, if we don't recognize that we as a society have turned our backs on tens of millions of Americans, betrayed them, I'm talking about both political parties. NAFTA was the gift of a Democratic administration, as was the throwing of 1 million people off of U.S. welfare rolls. If we don't begin to reincorporate these people, to re-enfranchise them back into a society, then I think our democracy is doomed.
Chris, I'd like to follow up with you in particular, and then I'm going to ask you to answer briefly, and then we'll move on to a more general question for all the panelists. In my own book on Revelation, I also noted that Revelation and the apocalyptic fantasy is really the proof text of the religious right, but it has also been read as a liberation theology text by Catholic theologians. Philip Berrigan, in particular, invoked Revelation and saw within it a liberating and egalitarian message, and not just this punishing message of the right wing. And then another commentator on Revelation compared it to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, and this reminds me that there is a segment of evangelical Christianity in the black churches of America that has always been the location of a progressive political agenda and continues to be. Do you think that this is specifically a Christian religious problem, or is there not an aspect of the Christian religious community that is in itself politically progressive and maybe even politically radical?
Well, I mean, as you know better than I, the book of Revelation is a very controversial book. Martin Luther, when he made the German edition of the Bible, relegated it to an appendix. And there's no question that there are passages within the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible that are morally indefensible. I mean, the Gospel of John is rabidly anti-Semitic. God blesses whole acts of genocide in the Hebrew Bible. I think that there is enough within the Bible for any bigot or tyrant or anybody who wants to justify cruelty and exclusion to sanctify it. That the slave owners did it. Reinhold Niebuhr had that great line. The religion is a good thing for good people and a bad thing for bad people. Unfortunately, this radical Christian right, these are bad people. I think that the sort of liberal church can often sort of gloss over and has not come to grips with the fact that you're right. The book of Revelation, although it, of course, I think if you're oppressed, I mean, just as many in the African American community, especially during the time of slavery, read in Exodus, Moses' flight from Pharaoh in Egypt in a very different way than the slave owners. I mean, it often depends. I'll tell you a little story. As having grown up in the church and graduated from seminary, I oftentimes I found reporting, especially in areas of tremendous conflict and among tremendous human suffering, that there were passages of the Bible that from my position of privilege I didn't understand. And I was in a refugee camp in Honduras for people who had fled the war in El Salvador. I covered the war there. And they were decorating the camp. It was in January, and it was they were about to celebrate the flight of Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus towards Egypt when Herod comes in the night that he kills the slaughter of the innocents. And I asked one of the refugees, who was probably an illiterate campesino, why this was such an important day. And he said, because that's the day Jesus became a refugee. And I think that the liberation theologians are onto something in the sense that, and especially with the Hebrew Bible, and I think arguably, most of the Christian Bible, these were written by groups that were oppressed. And I think that somehow for those of us who come from zones of privilege, not to be able to stand in that position of oppression makes us unable to understand biblical stories such as that one that I had heard my father read every year in church since before I could read.
I want to dig into a practical question. I'm going to invite each of the panelists to comment, and I'll start with Jack and move to the left. When I brought up the Muslim footbath in Minneapolis, I meant it by way of praise. I think it shows a decent impulse to accommodate and respect religious diversity and even to implement it. And yet, the reality is, if you are Jewish and you want to wear a skull cap, there are many schools, public schools, that will exclude you, and thus you will have to go to an Orthodox Jewish day school if you want to wear a skull cap. I see that as the kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of a democracy dealing with religious extremism. Do you accommodate the fundamentalist believer so that that believer stays within the mainstream, so that the Islamic woman who wears a headscarf can attend a public school and does not have to go to the environment of a Islamic fundamentalist school? Or do you enforce this absolute religious neutrality at the risk of accentuating this impulse towards isolation and extremism? Is there any solution to this problem in accommodating diversity?
In my opening remarks, I talked about the difference between religion as established by the state and religion as accommodated in the society. I would say that the example that you bring up, Jonathan, falls pretty well into the category of accommodation within the society. The president of that college was attempting to protect his school against possible lawsuits brought about by somebody slipping and falling on a wet bathroom floor, having tried to wash her foot in a basin that was 4 feet off the ground. I mean,
another American moment.
What an American moment, exactly, exactly. Everything is driven by the flight from possible lawsuits. But in a broader sense, you know what life is like in American schools. People will come in with one spike of orange hair down the middle of their skull, and hey, no big deal, somebody else is wearing a veil, somebody else has a Star of David. It's the American soup, and we take it in our stride, and it has as one of its very beneficial side effects that people get used to being in this country together. Toleration at the macro level begins with such micro encounters. I recall a story told by James Carroll, who is a former priest who lives in Boston, a columnist there and an author of a number of books. He was talking about how it came about that the Roman Catholic Church issued its declaration on relations with the Jews, apologizing for Christian, at least Catholic, anti-Semitism over so many centuries. It began with a mixed marriage in the cardinal's family. He had, I think it was his sister who had married a Jew, or maybe it's the other way around. At any rate, food comes into the picture somewhere. You know, he had had many happy meals in this Jewish household, and it bothered him that there was this official enmity. Well, encounters of that sort often begin in school relations and classmate relations, and the more a kind of casual toleration of that sort can be allowed, the less likely it is that entrenched divisions will bedevil our life later on. In that connection, it occurs to me to mention a very American move that the Muslim Public Affairs Council recently made, issuing a set of guidelines for relations between Sunnis and Shias, things that a polite Shia ought not to say about Sunnis and a polite Sunni ought not to say about Shia. Now, this is all on the near side of any kind of government establishment of religion. It's a kind of good manners, but it seemed to me the arrival of a kind of pluralism within the American Muslim community, and one of the reasons why I believe the American Muslim community will eventually have a very prophetic role to play in world Islam.
Chris?
Well, I mean, this sort of presupposes that there's something good about the mainstream. Having lived
Something good about the mainstream.
Not much. Having lived 20 years outside the United States, I mean, these are questions that you just don't ask. I mean, it's, you know, that kind of, it is a really attempt, you know, by enforcing any kind of code like that to destroy one's individuality, one's tradition, you know, and we as a country did a pretty good job of doing that to African Americans, you know, to the point that we even took away their names. And I think it's something that we should be particularly sensitive to. You know, the point is to get the kids into a classroom and hand them Thoreau's Walden. You know, the point is to get them to think. And it really doesn't matter what they wear.
Reza?
Boy, it's a really radical audience here. Yeah. Screw the mainstream. No, I'm totally with you. The thing is that Chris and I went to the same seminary, and this is what they teach you there. I'm not kidding. I think, look, this question about assimilation versus isolation, all you have to do is see, what the rest of the world is doing. Europe does not have a conception of accommodating or assimilating these kinds of religious ideologies into the larger society, and they are having a terrible time of it. The kinds of radicalization that we see in the UK and in France, and which simply do not exist in the United States, are more than just economic factors. Yes, it's true in the case of the Muslim community here in the U.S., they're very well integrated. They're very wealthy. They're very much a part of every sector of society. But it's more than that. I think that the reason that there is such accommodation, that there is such simple assimilation and integration here in the United States, whether you're a Jew or a Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or whatever, is that we do have a conception here that religion does have some role to play in the public realm. Maybe it's too great a role, no question. And maybe it has far too much influence in our laws and certainly in our foreign policy. But we understand that faith is not something that should be shunned from the public realm. And I think that creates a level of comfort, particularly for immigrant communities and people of other faiths besides Christianity and Judaism, that makes them much more likely to not just assimilate into culture, but also to moderate their own religious viewpoints and their own ideas. When I travel through the Middle East, especially, it's amazing how often you hear "Death to America! Death to America!" Can I get a visa? Because there is this recognition and I'm not kidding when I say this, that there is no country on this earth that gives Muslims the rights and the freedoms and the privileges to worship their religion however they see fit than the United States. They may hate our government, but they would do anything to have our lives. So again, I think you have to kind of have this notion, okay, if political participation is a cure for religious radicalism, it's a way of moderating religious extremism, and if that's true in Lebanon and it's true in Palestine, then it's got to be true here in America too, whether we like it or not, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. There is a real fear of this kind of radical, particularly Christian evangelism that has so thoroughly snaked its way into the highest levels of the government. But nevertheless, you know, to talk about rooting that out, it can be somewhat dangerous because we have to be very careful not to violate those ideas of freedom, the conceptions, particularly of the way we view faith and religion in this country and the freedom of faith and religion in this country. We have to be careful not to violate those ideas. And sometimes, to not violate them, we sometimes have to put up with some distasteful consequences. So again, I know I feel like I'm the guy dithering here back and forth, but nonetheless, I know that this is not just theory, and I don't want to make it sound as though I'm just speaking theoretically. But it is very important for us in recognizing the alarm and the dangers of this kind of religious radicalism to also understand that in most cases, the best cure for religious radicalism is assimilation, is integration, is participation, so that the people themselves can choose to adopt or ignore these ideas, these values, these traditions. And because this is such a small group, I think that's sort of inevitable. The rejection of those ideas is almost inevitable.
Let me follow up with Reza, and then Chris, I'll invite you to make your comment. Last night, Lawrence Wright won a book prize for The Looming Tower, a really compelling book about al-Qaeda. And he makes the point, and I'm very mindful of it when I suggest that somehow allowing people to wear headscarves and wash their feet in public schools will solve the problem of Islamic violence. I'm very mindful of the fact that the men who piloted the planes into the World Trade Center were in fact very cosmopolitan, highly educated. They had lived in America. It didn't do anything to moderate their idea about Islam. In fact, it made them into extremists. And I'm wondering, Reza, if you have can shed any light on that phenomenon, that when the fundamentalist comes to the West, in some cases he returns even more violently fundamental than when he arrived.
Yeah, well, I think first of all we have to eschew this notion that somehow all religious Islamic extremists have the same ideas or ideologies or grievances or tactics or agendas. It's simply not the case. Al-Qaeda and the larger jihadist movement that they represent, and by jihadism I'm referring to the transnationalist movement of militant Islamic Puritanism, Arab Islamic Puritanism that Al-Qaeda is such a integral part of. But there is a world of difference between Al-Qaeda and Hamas or Hezbollah or the Kashmiri militants or even the insurgency in Iraq. And so, we talk all the time about, well, the key to solving terrorism is social and economic development. That's the key to solving terrorism in Lebanon. It's the key to solving terrorism in Palestine, but it has no effect on jihadism whatsoever because the jihadists want nothing. They have no political agenda whatsoever. Their nominal goals are absurd even to them. They're not going to recreate the caliphate. They have no interest in. They know that these are impossible. Bush talks more about their goals than they talk about their goals. So, of course, as a movement that's really a social movement more than anything else, and that is using these symbols of jihad to create not just a collective identity, but to spur collective action, of course it's going to be made up of the best and brightest, in the same way that the radical anti-globalization movements are the best and the brightest. Those are middle-class kids throwing firebombs, not poor kids. So that's not unusual, it's not surprising, but that's not we're not talking about jihadism. Jihadism wants nothing, they have no goals, they have to be rooted out, they have to be destroyed. Simple. But for the vast majority of the other so-called Islamic radical or Islamic extremist movements, it is very important to not just address those grievances, but to bring them into the fold in order to moderate their tendencies, because they want something. If you want something, you can be talked to.
Chris,
I just want to...
I'm going to ask all the panelists to keep their comments brief because we're running out of time.
Just two quick issues. One, on the fact that middle-class people like, Muhammad Atta and others are involved. The problem with going into a culture like the American culture or the European culture is that it often, and many of these jihadists were actually born in the banlieues, outside of Lyon, Paris, and other places, is that they struggle with a terrible identity crisis. They don't fit into American or European society, and they don't fit in at home at all, and they become ripe for manipulation by the demagogues who make up this movement. Secondly, on the issue of religious involvement in the within government, we live in a country, the last sort of ratings that were done by the Christian Coalition, Eagle Forum, the three most, and Family Resource Council, the three most powerful Christian right advocacy groups in Washington, gave 45 senators, 186 members of the House of Representatives between an 80 to 100% approval rating. And this administration has handed over billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to these groups. Now, obviously, I don't have any problem with either an individual's or a group's religious orientation, but I have a tremendous problem with groups that discriminate based on sexual orientation, religious belief, and of course are using federal money to proselytize. That's unacceptable under the Constitution. That's a violation of the Constitution.
I just want to preview the fact that I'm going to pose one more question. I'm going to direct it to Jack and invite the panelists to chime in, and then I'm going to go to the mic. So if you are going to ask a question, you can prepare it now. Jack, you made the point that at an earlier stage of American history, at least officially, we were not declared not to be a Christian government. And I might add, Martin Luther put Revelation in the appendix. Thomas Jefferson excised it from the Jefferson Bible. He said Revelation was merely the ravings of a maniac. So we have a good set of traditions and precedents for avoiding these religious imprints on public policy. And yet, just this last week or so, the United States Supreme Court enacted, as a matter of law, a position on abortion which is a theologically based position. Our government has a position on stem cell research, which is a theologically based position. These are two what I would regard as crucial impingements on personal liberty and even personal health that spring out of this religious idea that has seized the American political entity. And in that sense, I'm asking, Jack, do you believe that this threat of dismantling democratic institutions to establish a religious tyranny that Chris is warning us against in many ways has already happened?
I don't think it's already happened because of the Supreme Court decision or the stem cell research position. Our society would be coming to some kind of determination along those lines, and there would be some kind of morality with regard to human life operative in any case. I wouldn't expect, even if all religious input were eliminated, that there would be unanimity on a point like that. I would expect a difference. What is more troubling to me, and I believe also to Chris, is the penetration of a religious ideology that's in love with death. That is, I'm more concerned about a penetration of religious ideology into the military than I am into anything that takes place in the full light of day on the Supreme Court. That troubles me more. I would also, I think, be concerned with lower level appointments that matter in the State Department, in the Justice Department. I also want to underscore my agreement with Chris that there is a good deal of despair abroad in our country, but it is not confined to the religious right, much less to the Christian right. David Foster Wallace did a very impressive article for The Atlantic on right-wing talk radio. And one of the conclusions he drew was that both the hosts and the audiences for these programs are filled with despair. They regard the country as doomed, though religion is not prominent in their exchanges. Why would they feel that way? It's because of that list of economic developments that he talked about, and some social developments that maybe are threatening to some people as well. Those things create a climate in which a hunger to somehow end it all can take over the mind. It's a kind of madness, not a religious only, secular as well.
I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is for any of the panelists who would like to comment. We've heard this afternoon that 78% of Americans consider themselves Christians. We also see statistics suggesting that 93% of the National Academy of Sciences do not believe in a personal God. We see a growing number of scientists, from Victor Stegner, Richard Dawkins, Edward O. Wilson, beginning to take on what they consider the problems of mythical thinking. Karen Armstrong has written at length about the conflict between mythos and logos. Do we live in an age in which the two are so in conflict that they're irreconcilable, or is it possible for a belief system based on mythical thinking to reconcile itself in the scientific age?
Well, I would just like to chime in by saying, in Karen's defense, there are people who will throw the baby out with the bathwater. They'll say there's nothing redeeming about the religious imagination. And Karen is a writer who celebrates the religious imagination. And I think that it's possible to hold both thoughts in your mind at the same time. And I think that's certainly true of Jack's work and Reza's as well. But I'll invite other panelists.
I would like to suggest that as an example of a middle point thinker, someone who is an atheist himself, but who regards religion as a permanent fixture in the human landscape, and who explains on scientific grounds why it is so and will remain so, is David Sloan Wilson. I would commend his new book, Evolution for Everyone, most especially. And in that book, he talks also about departures from what he calls factual realism with ominous consequences for practical realism that are of secular origin.
Sir.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for their contributions to this really important discussion today, and in particular you, Chris. And actually, I'd like to say, just by way of introduction, I'm somebody who's a product of 16 years of Catholic education, and it did two things to me. It gave me the best education the 12th century had to offer, and it also spurred me on to become a militant atheist and a communist. And so there you have it. And I wanted to say, one of the things your work on the rise of this Christian fascist movement. I've also studied the work of Bob Avakian, the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. He's done some very penetrating analysis.
I'm sorry, can we get a question? Because we're running out of time.
It's getting to it. All right. The point is that, he's done some very penetrating analysis around religious fundamentalism, and this whole point that you make and he makes about this unity that's developed between the Christian fascists and the political regime, and you have a rapacious empire, a political agenda, recreating the world. And on the other side, you have, and I think this is not just a handful of people, Reza, I think it's actually, you have an Islamic fundamentalist movement that's growing up due to the total, upheaval in the world.
Okay. Thank you for your...
No, I have a question.
I'm sorry, I don't hear one. I really have only minutes left.
I know, but you just let somebody speak on for a long time. Now, I'm just asking you this question. Where do you see hope? Because I personally, I think Avakian talks about a revolutionary solution.
Okay, let me just answer quickly. Let me answer quickly that there is an alliance between the corporate interests and this movement, because if your job is taken from you, outsourced, your community disintegrates, it's very comforting to buy into the mythology that once you get right with Jesus, you'll be taken care of. And that's why groups like Sam's Club and others will actually put Walmart will put these chaplains within their corporations, because it does, as Marx understood, acts as an opiate. And you're also, Jack, very right. This radical Christian group now controls over 50% of chaplaincy appointments within the military and the service academies, and I think that there's two things. One, we have to look at them really as functioning more as commissars. They're making people loyal to an ideology, not the democratic state. Okay,
I'm going to go to this gentleman. Short questions and answers, please.
I think the impact of the black church has been underestimated in our conversation, and the reality that the Christian right modeled their political methodology on the success of the black church to achieve the civil rights revolution. And so I'd like to comment on this bad people comment you made earlier. Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell were bad people before they became religious figures.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that it's really, the despair is cultural.
Yeah.
And the loss of segregation, and now in the immigration debate, it's a cultural much more than economic despair that people feel.
You make a very important point. And, you know, this movement tries to paint itself as the heirs of the civil rights movement,
exactly.
so that when I would attend rallies in Ohio, like at Patriot Pastors, they'll put pictures of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King up before they begin their rallies, talking about how they're the natural heirs, which of course they're not, because the figures like Falwell, for instance, got his rise with the attempts at desegregation. For 10 years, all he did was preach bigotry and exclusion from his pulpit. And then a wonderful sort of Stalinist move went and had all of those sermons recalled. We only have a copy of one. And it's raw racism. This movement comes directly out of the John Birch Society, which comes out of the World Anti-Communist League, which goes right back to the Klan, and every chapter of the Klan had a chaplain.
And that's the despair.
Thank you.
How do you see the future treatment of gay, lesbian, and transgender people by this new Christian evangelist government? Because I've heard some far left-wing fears of violence and relocation camps, and is that a little...
I think that the most important battle that we are fighting as a society is against this effort by this movement to strip American citizens of their rights because of their sexual gender. And we have been walking backwards on this issue. The gay rights movement is recoiling with almost no assistance from anyone else. If you are a professional gay who lives in an urban setting, you know, there's been a kind of inward focus. But if you're, you know, a gay kid pumping gas out in Mississippi in 17, life has become one of terror. And, you know, just look at the statistics for teenage suicides among gays. You're talking about Mel White, who I admire immensely.
The government, like, actually being violent.
Well, you know, none of these movements can succeed unless there is a crisis for them to ride, a period of prolonged economic collapse, another catastrophic terrorist attack, a series of environmental disasters, just as Milosevic needed to rise the collapse of Yugoslav economy to power this movement. But should that happen, and, you know, the indicators aren't great out there, then, you know, going after the most vulnerable segment of a society, it's what they did with the ballot measures in 2004, with 11 states voted to ban gay marriage. Gay marriage was already illegal in all of those states except for Oregon. 27 states already, a 1996 federal law defines marriages between a man and a woman. It is really about empowering a movement to crush the most vulnerable. And when they finish with those social deviants, they have a long list. And that attack on gays and lesbians is part of the march towards our door.
I'm going to stay on this side one more time. Yes, I just want to talk about 30 seconds and less, about the language that we even have used here today. Like, we use the language of militant Islam, and we don't talk about the militant Judaism or fundamentalist Jews. And when you talk about the scarf, the woman wearing a scarf wanted to go to a fundamental religious school rather than when a Christian person wants to go to a Christian school, and we don't use the same language for Christians and Muslims. So therefore, we're painting the Muslims to be a different people, worse than the rest of them. You know, that's one thing we want to conserve. And my question was, you know, how do we come about to change this and have the tolerance to come about?
Do you want to take a chance?
Well, I mean, look, we have to be very careful with our words, no question about it. I mean, if it is true that we're engaged in an ideological war, well, the greatest weapon in an ideological war are your words. And so we have to be careful how we talk, particularly because we are embroiled in a conflict with people who think that they're fighting a cosmic war between the forces of good and evil, between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and that what's at stake is their very existential being, their very identities. We're talking about the war in the exact same way. And by doing so, we're essentially validating, their viewpoint, and that's unwinnable. We can't win that kind of war. So we really do, as Jack said, have to strip these conflicts of their religious
I'm just going to have to break with Reza on this because, having lived in societies where I watched them try and domesticate the nationalists in Yugoslavia, any open society that tolerates the intolerant sees tolerance disappear and the tolerant along with them.
I would also like to add, they're in my notes, and I always try to make a point of it. James Charles Kopp is a Christian fundamentalist who murdered a doctor who performed abortion out of Christian fundamentalism. Baruch Goldstein was an American Jewish physician who took a machine gun to the mosque at the Cave of Patriarchs and murdered Muslims in the act of prayer. And so it is absolutely the case that religious fundamentalism is a poison that poisons the minds of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It's not a Muslim problem. I'm going to have to close. You'll be able to talk to the authors at the signing booth. I want to thank all of my colleagues for joining us, and thank you.
Please exit the door to the right. Please exit the door to your right. Thanks. This way. That way. No, how come you're walking?
An author panel on religion and politics of faith here at the 12th Annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, where we're bringing you day-long coverage of author events and panels live in Haynes Hall on the campus of UCLA. The LA Times Festival of Books started in 1996 as a gathering event for people who write, sell, and publish books. Currently, in its 12th year, the festival now attracts over 130,000 attendees, 300 exhibitors, and more than 400 authors. This year, the festival will feature 97 author panels and 6 outdoor stages. The festival is free and open to the public. It takes place here on UCLA's campus in Westwood, California. And if you'd like more information, you can visit the festival's website at latimes.com/Festival of Books. Coming up, a live panel titled Divided We Stand. Authors will focus on current issues facing the American public. You'll hear from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Edward Humes on evolution, education, and religion, and others. The Nation contributing editor Ayal Press, and others. And then a panel on terrorism. Featured authors include Lawrence Wright, the winner of this year's Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction, Terry McDermott, national correspondent for the LA Times, and RAND senior advisor Brian Michael Jenkins. A little bit later in the day, we'll bring you a panel on biography featuring biographers of 20th century icons. Former CNN CEO Walter Isaacson will speak about Albert Einstein, and Fox News Watch panelist Neil Gabler will discuss his recent biography of Walt Disney. Before we get to that, BookTV author interviews conducted at the 2007 Virginia Festival of the Book in Charlottesville. That'll be followed by the 34th Annual Conservative Political Action Conference.